Welcome to Sewer Mutant, the podcast for weirdos like you. I'm joined by my co-host John Eccleberry, and as always, our music is by Crudler. How you doing today, John?
Doing great. How are you doing over there?
I'm all right. Just got back from not just now, but back from a work trip to California last week that took a lot out of me. Excited to sit here and talk with you about comic books. Specifically the death of Captain Marvel. But first, we like to do an icebreaker to help listeners get to know us and help us get to know each other a little bit better. So this time, John's going to ask the icebreaker question. So what do you got for us, John?
Yeah, I was excited that you offered for me to do one of them. This is something I ask people in real life, too. And some people have a quick answer and some people do not have a quick answer. What is your favorite film?
So my go-to answer for this is usually Brick. Neo-noir movie by Rian Johnson with the guy with three names. One of the actors with three names.
Joseph Gordon-Levitt.
That's him. Yes. Yeah. Might not be a huge surprise after the Alex Center show that I'm a noir fan.
I actually still need to watch Brick. I know of it, but I haven't watched it. One of my friends, Ben's a huge fan of it and is always telling me to put it on my to-watch list. So I will definitely make that the next thing that I watch.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of movies that I like that would be up there along with it. Mandy is one with Nicolas Cage. Hold the Dark, a horror movie that came out a few years ago on Netflix. The original Conan the Barbarian. But yeah, Videodrome by Cronenberg. But yeah, Brick is the one that I usually just kind of rises to the top there for me. How about yourself?
Well, I'm pretty easy to figure out. I would have to say The Crow. But if I stretched it out to a top five, we do have one in common. Conan the Barbarian would be in my top five as well. I love the soundtrack and also just love the film itself.
Yeah, for sure.
And then I guess to round out the five, it'd probably be Taxi Driver, Gladiator, and the original Highlander, which is cheesy, but I love it. And I've watched it a lot of times. I think part of the way I rate how much I love a movie is how many times I've rewatched it. And those five movies I have spun my DVDs to death. And now that we're in the digital age, I've watched them some more times. So, if I want to watch something, like 10 or more times, it's probably something that really stuck with me. There's not a lot of modern movies that I rewatch, and the older I get, the less I rewatch. I usually just watch things once in the theater and call it a day, but there are some perennial ones that I revisit.
Yeah, I've actually kind of surprisingly gotten more into modern movies in the last several years. I mean, you probably noticed there are a few of the more recent movies in there, like recent by old guy standards. You have a couple of those from 2018, I think, and I would throw Mad Max Fury Road onto the list towards the top, but yeah. All right. So speaking of old guy stuff, let's talk about the death of Captain Marvel. So this was it's kind of interesting to read this coming off of Marvel Man / Miracle Man, because these are both the Marvel Captain Marvel and the Marvel Man are both kind of descendants in a way of the original Fawcett Captain Marvel. But the Marvel Comics one doesn't have, it's more separate from the original. He was just kind of created to secure the trademark on the name Captain Marvel. And so the reason I wanted to talk about this was it kind of touches on a few major topics for the dark age of comics. So one is the rise of the direct market. This was one of the first books that Marvel did that was specifically targeted and sold only to the direct market. Another is character deaths in comics. Obviously, the death of Superman's the big one, but the death of Jason Todd, which was also Jim Starlin, and the deaths of the Barry Allen Flash and Supergirl in the Crisis on Infinite Earths, which kind of kicked off the Dark Age, are some other really notable ones. And then, I don't know, basically everybody in Coast City died. It's, death was all around in the Dark Age. And the other piece of it is kind of just that movement towards realism or pseudo-realism in comic books, that those are all fairly big elements of the Dark Age. And this really touches on some of those.
Captain Marvel's interesting because unlike many other comic characters that have been killed off and then later resurrected, they never really have brought him back. They've had legacy characters, and they've had at one point a character impersonating him during Civil War, but they've never actually brought Captain Marvel back to life, and I kind of like that, and I hope they never do. I suppose at this point they won't.
Yeah, I think there's been some instances where he came back to life briefly, and I think the Silver Surfer like visited him in the afterlife. But yeah, he has actually stayed pretty dead over the years. So do you want to? I don't know. What did you think of this? I didn't know how it would hit when.
I liked it. I liked it from an art and coloring standpoint. I like some of Starlin's other stuff. I was more familiar with Warlock than with his Captain Marvel stuff, and I did read some of the other Captain Marvel stuff along with this, which we'll talk about in a bit here. But yeah, I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed they tried to bring as much realism as possible to a world that's, completely bonkers and, has cosmic craziness going on, but they wanted to ground it and have something like cancer be an actual threat to Captain Marvel, and they had in story
Yeah,
reasons why they were unable to cure that. And I know in your notes too, you'll talk about the idea that we have all these scientists in the Marvel universe inventing all kinds of stuff left and right, but they can't figure out how to cure cancer.
yeah. Yeah, I ended up liking this. I had read Starlin's original Captain Marvel run before this, and I had read his Warlock run. And then for whatever reason, I just skipped over this and went straight to Silver Surfer. I think I was just eager to get to Infinity Gauntlet, and Silver Surfer leads into that. So I had just so it was kind of just going back and filling something in for me in a way. But so I guess I came into it with a little bit of context there. Um, I liked it more than I think I liked it less than Warlock, but more than his initial Captain Marvel run. My main complaint is just that there's a lot of instances here where the figure drawing looks just flat out bad, like kind of amateurish, and I don't know. Yeah, it was just surprising and weird. Like I almost wonder if like he had an injury or something that was during this period, or I don't know what it could be. But the backgrounds look great. So I don't know if he was just like putting all his work into drawing like buildings and starships and stuff and just not worrying about the figure drawing, or if it was always maybe I should go back and look at some other stuff by him, and maybe I had just overrated his art previously. But I don't know. Yeah, it just doesn't. A lot of it just doesn't look good. But the color, I would also agree, is great. I mean, this was a really great time for comics color. They were starting to transition over to using better paper and more expensive printing techniques that could reproduce better color in comics. So you get an upgrade over the old newsprint 4-color process that that was familiar from the Golden Age and Silver Age. But at the same time, it's before everyone went fully into the world of digital color that how to just doesn't do it for me. So there's really really nice looking stuff in this. So to
And as you
lay out
mentioned, was they were thinking about the direct market when they put it out, and so this was the first in the line of Marvel graphic novels, and there were a whole bunch of different Marvel graphic novels, some of them with Marvel characters, some not. The third one is actually another Jim Starlin one that introduces his other character, Dreadstar. And then there's some really important ones like God Loves Man Kills is in there someplace. There's a bunch of,
the first appearance of the first appearance of New Mutants is in graphic
yes,
novel number
the
4.
first New Mutants is they have that before the first issue of the ongoing, and it's in kind of a larger magazine size format, and as you mentioned, on better paper.
Yeah, yeah. There's a bunch of these. I think there was like a Frank Miller and a Bill Sienkiewicz Elektra one that I had never even heard
Yeah,
of. I
Elektra
didn't.
Lives. Yeah, we'll talk
Yeah,
about that eventually. That's a good one.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I knew about Elektra Assassin, but yeah, there's a bunch of there's a bunch of them, and yeah, look at more of them. There's a Futurians by Dave Cockrum, who created the new X-Men. And yeah, just a lot of significant work that a lot of it was like God Loves Man Kills is something that I don't think of as like, oh, this is part of a title that was called Marvel graphic novel. The first Walt Simonson Starjammers and Dreadstar, all those things, like it's they're all things I knew about, but like didn't necessarily think of realize that they were part of this ongoing title. And you pointed out to me that DC also had DC graphic novel. And I think the only one of those, when I looked at the list that I'd heard of, was Dogs of War by Jack Kirby, which was his much delayed conclusion to the Fourth World saga. And I didn't realize that was, I'm in the same boat as like God Loves Man Kills. This is a classic work that just happens to be part of this graphic novel line. So yeah, maybe to expand a little bit on the background of the character. So initially, he was completely different from the Fawcett / Shazam Captain Marvel. He was just a Kree warrior who his name just happened to be Marvel, and so they called him Marvel, Captain Marvel. But then in the graphic novel, it kind of the death of Captain Marvel, it explains a lot of his history and background, so people who aren't familiar with the character can kind of jump in and get most of the story from that. But he eventually they added this twist where he's trapped in the negative zone, but he can swap places with Rick Jones, who is kind of the Hulk's sidekick. So it gives it that teen turns into a superhero vibe that the original Captain Marvel had, and that Marvel Man is descended from as well. So there's some commonality, though. By the time Marvel graphic novel number 1 hits, I guess they've become disentangled in that way, and they're just living their own separate lives. So you dug in, I think, a little bit more into the history and context of this book, right?
Yeah, I after I read it, like you said, they do have a background for the character, so I do think that you can read this on its own and it plays fine. But I just kind of thought, geez, I don't know like some of these secondary characters. I don't really know anything else about Captain Marvel. I hadn't read any of his series, and so I wanted to go back and read some of that stuff. So I decided for context that I am a great maker of spreadsheets. This is something you should know about me. So I immediately made a spreadsheet of all of Jim Starlin's stuff, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna read all of the Captain Marvel stuff leading up to the death of, and then I can, get an idea of what's going on. And the interesting thing that I learned is that when you do that, it's really just reading all of Thanos' appearances. So in Iron Man 55, which is actually a really important book, you get the first Thanos, the first Drax the Destroyer, the first Blood Brothers, you get Mentor, Eros, Isaac, Kronos. These are all in the mythology of Starlin's Titans. He just like lays it all out in this one issue. And I kind of feel like if he'd been working on some other Marvel book that wasn't Iron Man, he still would have tried to talk them into letting him do this. Because for one issue, it feels like there's this giant, fully formed idea that he's like, "Oh, here's my cosmic saga. Here's all of it, and then let's run from there." And so you get all these introductions in this one issue of Iron Man, and then he goes on to be the penciler and eventually plotter of Captain Marvel, and he decides to pick up all those ideas that he laid down in that issue of Iron Man. So in Captain Marvel 25 through 33 and Avengers 125, there's a story called the Thanos War. And there's a couple other tie-in issues to Marvel feature number 12 and Daredevil 105. I thought it was weird that Daredevil somehow got looped into this whole cosmic thing, but there is a
Mm-hmm.
segment in that Daredevil issue that features the origin of Moondragon, who's another connected character to
Yeah, and that one's
the whole
not
thing.
by Starlin though, right? It's a Steve Gerber joint.
Starlin draws the segment with
Okay.
Moondragon in the middle of the book, but otherwise, and it's kind of weird because it like shows like Thanos as a child in that, like he's this like little grumpy, adolescent Thanos, and I just thought it was funny. But so I read all of that, and then as a cherry on top, I read Captain Marvel 34, which is the first appearance of Nitro, and then tells the story of his encounter that eventually leads to the cancer that kills him in the Death of book. Most of these things were reprinted in 1985 as a 5-issue reprint series called The Life of Captain Marvel, and then they did a collected edition called The Life and Death of Captain Marvel. You can still find that out there for pretty cheap. There's also other reprint editions, various ones that have this content. I know everything's kind of going to omnibus editions now, and so they're more interested in including everything. So you can buy omnibus that have all the way from Captain Marvel number 1 to whatever, but if you just want to read the Jim Starlin stuff, that's collected together out there too. There was even one at one point called Captain Marvel by Jim Starlin that has just this stuff. Between Life and Death is when Warlock happens, and those are the rest of Thanos' 70s appearances. And his encounter with Warlock leads to both of them getting killed. When Captain Marvel dies, Thanos and Warlock are also dead and haven't appeared for a little while. And then they don't come back until Infinity Gauntlet in the 90s. And you had mentioned Infinity Gauntlet and that being the thing that you wanted to kind of get to and skip past some stuff for. And I think even though people know more about the Infinity Gauntlet in popular culture, even though people know more about the Infinity Gauntlet, the Thanos War, if you read it, is really like the template for that story. It's about Thanos getting the cosmic cube to obtain godhood and to impress death. which is like the same story that's in the Infinity
Yeah,
Gauntlet, except for he gets the Infinity Gems instead. And so it's almost like he's just retelling that story on a bigger stage with more characters.
they even end up defeating Thanos in kind of the same way, or Thanos kind of allows himself to be defeated in the same way in those two stories. I don't know if you've read Infinity War, but that also is basically a retelling, or like it is the same to Warlock, the original Warlock series, as Infinity Gauntlet is to the original Thanos War storyline. Kind of just goes through a lot of the same setup where the same villain, the Magus.
Hmm.
Thanos is as a good guy in it, or at least initially. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. It seems like he just came back to Marvel and was like, "All right, I'm gonna just do these same stories, only like you said, like on a bigger scale, more characters."
Which seems to have worked for him because this is a giant
Yeah,
enduring work now that people go back to and enjoy. But I think that anybody that likes those stories owes it to go back and read the original Thanos War, because I don't know if a lot of people have, or they know about it. I hadn't read it. This is the first that I'd read it, and as I'm reading it, I'm just going, "Hey, wait, like this is the Infinity Gauntlet, but like the OG version."
yeah,
And it's really cool. Captain Marvel 29 has the whole origin of the Titans, which are kind of based on Greek myth, and that was a great issue for me. And a few years later, you had mentioned the Fourth World. Jack Kirby came back to Marvel, and he had been at DC for 5 years, and he did the Fourth World Saga. And then when he returned to Marvel, he worked on Captain America and then also the Eternals. And the Eternals was supposed to be like separate. It wasn't in the regular Marvel continuity. It was just a separate thing that he created. And he also kind of based that on Greek myth. And so it was not in any way connected to Starlin stuff, but in the late 70s and early 80s, Roy Thomas kind of saw that connection, and him and also the editors, Mark Gruenwald and Ralph Macchio, wrote the Eternal Saga and Thor, which kind of tries to put all this stuff together in the same continuity. So suddenly the Eternal stuff and the Jim Starlin stuff becomes enmeshed as the same story, even though it wasn't originally intended that way. And they also loop in the 1950s Marvel Boy character created by Stan Lee and Russ
huh,
Heath. So all that cosmic stuff kind of gets tied together for Marvel's continuity. But
yeah.
that's a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah, there's also another connection there in that, like, Thanos is kind of, I wouldn't go so far as to say a ripoff, but he's definitely influenced by Darkseid from
Right, exactly.
the
So
fourth,
everything's
from the,
kind of,
uh,
yeah, everything's kind of feeds on itself and is
and
a
you can
little bit
see,
incestuous.
yeah, like Mentor is kind of like the patriarch from the fourth world, and Eros is maybe a little bit like Light Ray. So, yeah, it seems like there was, yeah, it's interesting to see those kind of get bound up and merged later. Yeah, so outside of the actual comics in and of themselves, the direct, like I mentioned, like this was a big moment for the direct market. So and I'll explain a little bit of what that actually is for those who aren't familiar with the term. It just means comic books sold directly to comic book stores, or comic book specialty shops. This is even really before our time, when comic books were sold to newsstands primarily. I mean, growing up, I never really saw newsstands. I mean, I saw the spinner racks at the grocery store, and that's how I started getting into comic books. But the idea of a newsstand as an enterprise selling magazines and newspapers and comic books is not something that I'm actually really all that familiar with from firsthand experience. But that was the original way that they were sold. The downside for publishers is that they were returnable. So if the comics didn't sell, the newsstand sellers were supposed to rip the covers off and send them back, and or send the covers back and then get reimbursed and destroy the coverless versions of the comics. So in the 70s and early 80s, the comic book market had been struggling quite a bit over a number of years. By that point, the Star Wars comic book really helped Marvel, and the Superman movie, the original Christopher Reeves one, really helped DC out. But the newsstand sales were decreasing. There was also a lot of allegations of fraud there, where newsstands would claim to not sold something and then just sell them without the covers or whatever. the case may be. I think in some cases they didn't even have to send the covers back, so they could just say it didn't sell. So the publishers were really looking for new ways to reach customers. So the publishers started to sell stuff directly to the comic book shops as well. Then in the very late 70s, you started to see companies like Eclipse and the publishers of ElfQuest, Dave Sim with Cerebus, various creators like that, just selling their comics to comic book stores. And that helped them get around the Comics Code Authority so they could do whatever they wanted. They didn't have to figure out how to get onto newsstands. And they started to see, significant success enough to maintain businesses and keep afloat. And Jim Shooter started to notice that some comics did better in the direct market than they did on the newsstand, and that their direct market sales were increasing where their newsstand sales were decreasing. So he wanted to really tap more into that market. So he came up with the idea of starting to do products that were sold only to the direct market and bypass the newsstand entirely. So the Marvel graphic novel series was one of those endeavors. And like I said, I think it may have been the first thing that Marvel published that was only for the direct market. Around this time, they also did reprints of Warlock, I guess, also kind of capitalize on Jim Starlin coming back to Marvel after some time away. And I think those were kind of like double-sized comics that would have 2 issues of Warlock per issue. So not trade paperbacks, but starting to kind of tap into that idea of having perennial books kept in print and tapping into the direct market as a way to reach people. And then on the character death sides, there'd already been a lot of character deaths in comics before. Bucky, Gwen Stacy, Thunderbird from X-Men, Jean Grey, and then we talked about Warlock dies in Warlock. One of the earliest examples I found was in the Golden Age Daredevil. In like his second appearance, he seems to die, but then it turns out that it was his brother wearing the Daredevil costume. So he comes back within the same issue, but I kind of count that as in that world of like characters dying and coming back. But up to that point, deaths hadn't really been done as big events. Jean Grey's death, I think, kind of was, but they were always sort of also like liabilities. They didn't know how fans would react. But it turned out that the deaths of Gwen Stacy and Jean Grey in particular, even though it made a lot of people angry, they also juiced sales, especially the death of Jean Grey. I think that's what catapulted X-Men into being Marvel's #1 comic, like going past Spider-Man and Fantastic Four, which was, now it seems obvious. Yeah, of course, X-Men's Marvel's biggest book. But back then it was not. It was kind of more of a cult favorite book. And Fantastic Four was the big team from Marvel. So Jim Shooter knew by this time then that fans, especially collectors, liked these character death books. And he saw this direct market opportunity. So he tapped Jim Starlin and said, "Hey, do you want to kill Captain Marvel?" I don't know if it was, because he had done Captain Marvel before, or if he knew that Starlin could be counted on to do some unsentimental character murder because he had already done in Warlock. I guess Shooter also asked him to kill off the Master of Kung Fu, and Starlin, who was also co-created by Starlin, and Starlin declined to be the executioner of that particular character. But that was, that's who Shooter was turning to for this. And like you said, what's kind of crazy is that Captain Marvel stayed dead for all this time. And so the other key theme that I mentioned is the realism in comics. And that was something that was actually surprised me about this book going into it, because I really didn't know anything about it other than that Captain Marvel died in it. So I didn't realize that he dies not from, like, he doesn't die in a battle with like Doomsday or something like that. He dies slowly of cancer over the course of the book. And that's something else that I don't really think I've seen anywhere else, like having a superhero die of essentially he got cancer while he was doing superhero stuff, but dying of something essentially like natural causes the way anybody else might die, and having to put his affairs in order and tell his romantic partner that he was dying. And that's a great scene in this book that Starlin does without dialogue. You just see it like kind of from a distance that they're having this conversation on a bench, and you just know what he's telling her because he's already established that he has to go and tell her this. I thought that was great storytelling there on Starlin's part, and it was a really good scene, really affecting. So yeah, you had touched on this before. This title also, this book, like kind of calls out the superficiality, maybe. I don't know, the monomania is what I would say of superheroes on fighting evil and fighting crime and not using their powers or intellect for anything else to improve the world, essentially, which, for makes sense, for kids comics. But when you're looking at these things from an adult lens, it gets a little weird. How is it that the Beast, who has done all this genetic science research on mutants and mutation, how has he not done cancer research at this point? Why can't Doctor Strange cast a spell that dispels cancer? That is never answered in this book. So part of the twist here, just maybe spoil it slightly, is that because Captain Marvel is Kree, none of the Earth science, or actually, it's kind of interesting that they say, like, many planets every planet has a form of cancer, essentially, and they all have different names for it. And some planets have cured it, but it only cures their species of creature. Like, so they can't necessarily apply the lessons learned on one planet to another. And the problem is compounded by the fact that Captain Marvel is on the outs with the Kree, so they're not helping at all with the research. And so all of Marvel's scientists who live on Earth are trying to figure out how to cure Captain Marvel's cancer, and they end up coming up short, and it's really sad. There's another great scene in it where the Skrulls come to pay their respects to Captain Marvel as he's dying, and they point out that the Skrulls came because they were his enemies, but they respected him. But his own people, the Kree, never showed up for him. Very, very sad. And
kind of a poignant idea too, that the Kree are a warlike people, and so they have this discussion that the Kree didn't like spend a lot of time doing things like research or healthcare, because they were all about the murder and destruction, and so they didn't expect to live long.
Yeah.
As a warrior, he ends up dying that way himself.
Yeah. So it really just gets into death and the sorts of death where you see it coming, as opposed to the sudden violent deaths that you usually see in comics. And that's where, again, that's an element of realism that I feel like we don't see a ton of in comics, even today. Looking at Marvel, man, there's lots of mature topics for superheroes in that, but this sort of approach to death wasn't one of them. I guess this was inspired by Jim Starlin losing his own father, I think, to cancer. So that makes sense. And you can kind of see parents as superheroes to a child. My father had a major heart surgery several years ago now, and he's doing good. But afterwards, or really before and afterwards, to see one's father, who as a child especially, you see them as a superhero, as a god, to see them in like such a diminished state is very sad. And it is, I feel like having Captain Marvel, having a superhero die that way, is a good metaphor for that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. My dad just had triple bypass like a month or two ago, and so it is tough when you see them very weak. And then my grandfather died like a month ago, and so it was interesting to read this like right around the same time as all of that stuff. And it's definitely interesting to hear that Starlin kind of based that on his own experience.
For sure, yeah. Just gonna go check in our notes and what we haven't gotten into. You pointed out that that Starlin is from Michigan.
Yes, he is. I would be remiss to not mention that. I am a Michigander myself, and I kind of live in like a Detroit suburb, basically. And he's from Detroit, and there's one of the issues of Captain Marvel, issue 30's title page says, "Brought to you by the Detroit Gang," and it was done by Starlin, Al Milgrom, and letterer Tom Orzechowski. They were all Detroit natives, and I thought that was kind of fun and a neat thing to see. And I've been interested in other Detroit comic book artists, and particularly, of course, James O'Barr, which we both enjoy. And I was kind of reminded of him here. Starlin's also a veteran. O'Barr's a veteran too, and I just kind of saw a parallel there. But yeah, that's always fun when you see the creators from your own area.
Yeah. I mean, from O'Barr's generation, there's also Guy Davis and Vince Locke, like the other early Caliber guys, and who also went on to be very big after their humble beginnings at Caliber and Arrow. Yeah, I think that was something I was thinking about too, is it really seemed like Michigan punches above its weight class when it comes to comic book creators.
Right.
Michigan's really something in the water over there, I guess. Sure, there's a bunch
Yeah,
from Ohio, but
companies too. I mean, there's a lot of like indie companies that came out of Michigan as well, like Caliber and Arrow and that you mentioned and others. I'd like to meet Starlin. Starlin probably doesn't do shows anymore, but I kind of that's almost like, and I don't really go that often, but that might be on my bucket list now to meet Starlin at some point because he's a pretty influential creator on the whole if you look at it.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think Warlock is a great. I don't know if it's like underrated, but it maybe a little bit and like kind of overlooked. It's not one that I hear people talk about all that much as like one of the great classics, but I think it was way ahead of its time. Reading it, and it kind of feels like 2000 AD or something. The types of stories he was telling in that, like just really kind of cheeky sci-fi stories. I think, yeah, just a really high quality book, like really good art in it, as I recall. Though maybe like I said, after after looking at the death of Captain Marvel, I feel like I'm gonna have to go back and check and see if he was as good as I remember him being. I think probably he was. I think maybe it's also just like the things look different in like better color. I don't know.
No, I don't think I hated the art in Captain Marvel as much as you, or at least I didn't notice it as much.
It wasn't all of it, but there were just some drawings that I just looked at and was like, man, this doesn't look like professional comic book art at all.
Yeah, I could see it. I could see it. And I do think that the art in the earlier stuff is maybe better. I think the art in both the issues of Captain Marvel that I read and the issues of Warlock was more interesting probably than in the death of. All of this stuff of course was like before my time reading comics because I started reading in the early 90s, but when I very first started buying, Marvel had this like product out that you could buy in department stores or whatever that was like a little comic box that came with 5 comics, and one of the comics that came with it was Silver Surfer 34, and that's Jim Starlin's return to Silver Surfer, and that was the first issue of Silver Surfer I ever read, and I thought that was pretty cool. I think Thanos shows up at the very end of it. He's definitely in that run leading up to Infinity Gauntlet, but that got me buying Silver Surfer, and so I did read that stuff going forward, but I had never read any of this 70s or 80s stuff before.
Yeah, I just picked it up a couple summers ago. I just decided I wanted to read some Cosmic Marvel and started with the Iron Man with the first appearance of Thanos and read up through Infinity War. And I was going to go on to Infinity Crusade, but by the time I got there, I think I was done with Cosmic Marvel for a while.
It feels like kind of another rehash of the same ideas. I mean, it is there's some interesting stuff there, and I did buy all those when they were coming out, but I think my interest started to wane a bit during Infinity Crusade as well. And there were like so many tie-ins, but I did really enjoy the Silver Surfer during that time period. Yeah, man, that Iron Man 55 is crazy to me. Just how much stuff he packed into one issue. Like Thanos isn't even like the cover character. Like Drax is the big cover character that's introduced in that issue, but and all those other characters are introduced at the same time. And Drax is kind of interesting too. Like I thought the whole backstory of Drax was cool, and I didn't really know all of that. I was familiar with the Virgin from around the time of Infinity Gauntlet. Starlin got to write a whole series of Warlock and the Infinity Watch that spun out of
Hmm.
the Gauntlet, and I ran for I don't know a bunch of issues, 30 issues or something like that. And he had some other miniseries and stuff too. But I was familiar with that like time period of those characters. But seeing their earlier origins for like Moondragon and Drax and the other characters was pretty neat. And, like the connection between Drax and Moondragon was really interesting. And yeah, I just think it's something worth revisiting if people like that other stuff, but they haven't read this.
Yeah, something I don't think that Starlin necessarily gets credit for is that the modern Guardians of the Galaxy, like the version that's in the movies, is kind of the Infinity Watch. It's not a one-to-one set of characters, but it's a similar set of characters. So he kind of created the big Guardians of the Galaxy that everyone knows.
Yeah, that's like Guardians being like really popular is like a weird thing because the original Guardians are totally different characters than are in the movie, and they're like in the future. And then when they decided to make the movies, they kind of pulled together more modern characters from the contemporary time period, but they were all cosmic characters. And I think Dan
I think
Abnett
they
and Andy
predated.
Lanning did a series in like maybe 2008 during the Annihilation arc that had that team,
Yeah, yeah.
and so
The
they
team
kind of They based it on that.
Yeah, the team predates the MCU version of it. I don't think that they were put together for the movie, but at the same time, yeah, it's like it's a whole different thing. Like they just decided to use that name for a completely different set of characters. And yeah, I don't know if we'll ever see I mean, I'm sure we will because nothing ever stays gone forever. But the 30th century original Guardians of the Galaxy they haven't been seen in a very long time. I think we can probably wrap it up here. So I think next time, are we talking about Manhunter by Archie Goodwin
Ooh,
and
yeah.
Walt Simonson?
Yes,
All
we
right.
are.
Okay. Well, tune in next time then, dear listeners, for Manhunter.